So our first ever podcast with video from memory anyway, and Paul Rogers joined us, whose work I've admired for many years. It was not far from here, over 10 years ago now. I was studying at Leeds Met. I came straight out of the army into peace studies, which was a hell of a transition. Was studying with Dave Webb, who Paul also knows. He's a great academic in his own right, and I'm sure it was on a reading list that Dave Webb gave me that I first came across the book Losing Control, which is Paul's book, which is quite a short book, but it's immensely informative and was really powerful for me because he's very succinct. And it'd be cool to just maybe come back to that, because it was the first time, I suppose, when you start reading IR and it can be a bit dry, and you start with the kind of orthodox stuff. I think I started with the very orthodox stuff, and Losing Control was the first time I had something that was really readable and really clarified beyond the orthodoxy what should be important and what I should be thinking about and writing about and reflecting on. And it was very different to the very orthodox stuff, which is all about big power and guns and ships and nuclear weapons, because it spoke about issues like climate change, inequality, marginalization, and all these issues which are often obscured. And I think that book, correct me if I'm wrong, was actually published 10 years before that, in 2010, is that right?
Yes, in fact, I've just rewritten it during lockdown. We've now got a new edition out, which brings it up to date, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I've seen it. I know it's been edited and revised many times, and I'm sure it's still brilliant. I recommend it to all the viewers, all our listeners. It would be great, seeing as you've got a new edition of that out, just to reflect on how those issues have developed and how they continue to shape politics now, so many years after you first wrote it.
Well, if you look at that now, I mean, going back, the original thesis, if you like, rather sort of unnecessary word, was that there are three major issues which face us, which there are many others, but these are the key ones. One is the socioeconomic divisions, the fact that the world economy is not working for everybody, not remotely, and it's very good for maybe a small minority, okay for a minority, but very bad for most in compared with what they would expect. And what we now see in many parts of the world is what I would call a revolution of frustrated expectations. Mm-hmm. You know, 30 years ago, people talked about the revolution of, revolution of high expectations. Everybody would get better off in some way, even though there would still be a disparity. Now it's frustration. And you'll see it I think more in terms of what you might call revolts from the margins. Mm-hmm. That, I think, is a general issue. I was looking at that basically in the late 1990s, and I pointed to the rise of paramilitary movements. And this was about a year or two before 9/11 when it was published. And I actually said there was a very real possibility you would get catastrophic attacks. And I specified, in fact, the World Trade Center as being a possibility, because there had been an attempt to destroy it back in 1993. Yes. The book also had the second issue was limits to growth, environmental limits to growth, and the growth really of the problem of climate change and climate breakdown. I spent 8 years lecturing in environmental sciences, although it's now nearly 50 years ago, so I've got a background in that as well. But the third issue was our misunderstanding of security, the way it's seen entirely in terms of military means, and human security is far wider than that. But the problem is the way that is normally seen is it's really focused on military-industrial complexes, which are very much about maintaining control. And what I was suggesting was, in fact, we're more likely to lose control, that maintaining an unjust and limited war would eventually prove to be disastrous. So that was really what I was arguing. When it was published, I wouldn't say it sank like a stone, but it was not widely reviewed because it was something rather different. And then I think I got rung up by the publishers about 3 days after 9/11 and said, can you do an extra chapter quickly? Which I did. And that was the one I think people have mostly seen. It came out a couple of years after 9/11. And that actually went into some foreign editions as well. So since then, obviously, I've followed it through. And the grim thing is that so much of what I was arguing, and I wasn't the only one, other people were seeing it through similar lenses. It's just as though it's sort of unfolding before your eyes. And in fact, the idea of losing control now seems to make much more sense. Countries are now trying to hang on to control. And you see it very clearly, NATO having been involved in 3 disastrous wars, well, 4 in some ways. I mean, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya certainly, and then the recent air war against ISIS.
Yes.
None of those are working as intended. Two have been absolute disasters, Afghanistan and Iraq. And so, in a sense, even so, NATO carries on. It's almost as though they're relieved to have something like Ukraine,
Yes.
which is a kind of war they actually understand. But that does not make it any easier. And we've not made much progress. In some areas we have made progress. I mean, the one area which I think is really changing rapidly and very hopeful is the capacity to decarbonize quickly. There's a huge amount happening there. It's so cheaper. Renewables by and large are the cheapest form of electricity by a long measure now. The major oil and gas companies haven't caught up. They don't want this, obviously.
No.
But it would be possible to decarbonize with incredible speed, the sort of speed we actually need to do, but we haven't got the political will. So I suppose what I've been trying to do in a way is focus on that, plot the way the wars are developed, plot the way they've gone wrong, and always try and point to some alternatives, which is what I try to do a little bit more in the current edition, sort of devote more of a chapter to, what would be the right way forward. How do you handle the problem of neoliberalism? This kind of version of economy, which is clearly not fit for purpose.
No.
How do you get a fairer system? How can you apply it to basically meeting up to limits to growth? And most of all, how can you change our thinking about security? Because it's clearly wrong. So I think that's how it's happened over the last 20 years. And there's still a very long way to go. And there's some areas which are very depressing, other areas where there are signs of hope, and I think one hangs on to those to some extent.
For sure. It's actually a theme which has emerged over this series. Even with the wide diversity of guests, we've often come back to this idea, because and we've written about this at Forces Watch as well. The military recognises climate change is happening. It knows it's happening and it accepts it fully, but its response, its ideas are limited to how do we militarized borders, what are the military implications of big movements of people coming across continents, and we're seeing a little snapshots of that already with the the culture war stuff particularly, and the reality.
Absolutely.
Is that a characterization you recognise?
Yeah, absolutely.
They know it's happening, but they don't have any answers.
Absolutely. I've been very lucky right back since the early 80s. I've been lecturing at defence colleges. They originally asked me to give the sort of the alternative view on nuclear issues, which I did happily, and went to the Joint Service College, the Royal College of Defence Studies, and the RAF Staff College when there was a separate one. And when the staff colleges all amalgamated, I've been going to those for most years. In fact, I was even an external lab examiner at both colleges for the MAs and PhDs. So I had a lot to do with the military, but I agree with you, actually. I mean, you look at, the Development Concepts and Doctrine Centre, DCDC, which is the ministry's own think tank. The stuff it was writing 10 years ago about the risks of limits to growth was extraordinary. But you're absolutely, I agree with you entirely in that essentially, from a military perspective, our role is to defend the realm. So if we have major problems in the future, then we've got to work out how to meet them. Not speak truth to power and tell the politicians to avoid these problems arising.
Yeah.
It was curious. About 7 or 8 years ago, I had an email out of the blue from a research unit at Oxford University that specialises in the changing character of war. And they were doing a seminar which was going to be on, let's get it right, the security risks to Britain of weak and failing states. And they said, look, we've got a range of people who really know particular parts of the world where there are problems. We'd like you to try and do a bit of an overview at the start of the day and set the scene. Well, it's, a couple of nights in Oxford in July was rather nice. I knew there would be maybe diplomats or Foreign Office people. I got down there. It was the commandant and all the senior officers of the SAS. With some SBS people in, some people from MI6. In other words, it was the heart of the Special Forces. And it was very interesting. I did the talk and talked a lot about the problems of climate change. Interestingly, the next speaker was a woman, very bright analyst from Islamic Relief. And they're based in Birmingham, not London. People know less about them, but they're a big aid organisation. And she just departed from what she was going to say. She said, I'd just like to comment on something Paul Rogers said. We find that getting our reports from our field officers, and of course we operate in many semi-arid countries, one of the things that concerns them more than ever is the changing climate, and particularly its impact on food supplies, food production. So basically, the audience at least had the opportunity for two people to get to grips with this. But when I was talking to them, a couple of people over dinner that night, they saw it very much in terms of, well, how do we prepare for it? And I said, well, isn't your job also to speak truth to power? And no. I mean, their view was that politicians won't listen to us. And my suggestion was they would probably listen to you when they won't listen to anybody else.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, so I think that was a huge disappointment in a way, but a real lesson. So it's not the military don't think ahead. I mean, you'll know from your own experience, if you're trying to work out a new weapon system and the rest, you're talking about a decade or more, maybe even more.
Yeah, absolutely.
And policies change slowly. But the net effect is they do not see it as part of the culture. I think what you said is spot on. It's not part of the military culture to look long-term ahead. And of course, the whole problem with limits to growth is you have to do things now to prevent problems in 10 or 15 years' time. The change, of course, on that one is that we're now seeing the climate breakdown happening in front of our eyes.
Yes.
And people can't escape it. We also have the climate scientists broadly much more confident about what they say. They're less prepared to sort of try and compromise views. So many of them know that it's happening. So many of them privately very worried. They'll speak more openly about it. And, of course, you're getting a small but very significant minority of the population absolutely engaged in this and furious that governments aren't taking any notice.
Yes.
So that's a mixed message. But coming back to your military thing, it's an example where, in a sense, people do not rethink what we should mean by the term security. I think little think tanks like Rethinking Security are trying to do a good job. But, compared with all the big think tanks working on strategic studies, all the universities and the rest, they're few and far between. Yes. I mean, you did peace studies at Leeds Met, or Leeds Beckett, as we now have to call it. Yeah. I'm being based at Bradford. There's a very good unit down at Coventry. There are a number of individuals, somebody like Anna Strafianakis down at Sussex on arms sales, for example. But that's about the lot. And you look at the number of security centres, courses in security, all the conventional sort of security. Yeah. That, I think, is what we're up against. It's the military-industrial complex. Yeah. And it's a very powerful entity.
Yeah, I guess the status quo, isn't it? And I think it is that thing of speaking truth to power. It's always fascinated me because you are, I suppose, an outside voice in a way. Yeah, you're a very, very esteemed scholar. I've heard you mention these stories before. Do you, when you find yourself in a room with you're invited to talk to MI6 and the SAS, do you relish those opportunities?
I don't know about relish, because obviously normally I don't get nervous with these things.
Yes.
But with a group like that, you do.
Yes.
Once I get started, it's not so bad. I relish in a sense, yes. I mean, it's great to have that. It's a rare opportunity. Yeah. I mean, I know the Joint Service Defence College, which is big, nearly 300 students, about third British, 2/3 from abroad. They're an incredible audience. And they will listen, but they will obviously find it rather difficult to take. But at the same time, the commandant at that college normally will get a Quaker, a pacifist, to talk to them as well.
Yes.
But I think if you look at all the list of outside speakers, there may be one other, maybe three of us who are basically giving anything like a different view.
Yeah.
I remember talking to several officers. I mean, these are sort of mid-career people, major, some half colonels and the rest, occasional one-star. I spoke to 4 or 5 who were from the Middle East or Sub-Saharan Africa. And one of them said to me, we're standing in a circle just before lunch, said, you're the first lecture we've had on this entire course which rings true. From his perspective, as somebody from the global south, seeing the world in a different way. So I'm afraid we've got a long way to go. But it's a privilege to be able to be just one little bit of trying to do it, I suppose.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's a role I know that you take up very well. It's a very important one. I wanted to, obviously we've just had the Iraq anniversary. Obviously, quite a lot of people I know were in Iraq, and it's mixed, a lot of mixed feelings, a lot of regimental reunions and stuff happening, and people reflecting on their lived experiences
Yes.
of Iraq as much younger men and women, and that war. Around that time, you wrote an article in which you talked about a 30-year war. I think you, more than a lot of other people, understood the complexity into which people like me and those Iraq veterans were being thrust at that time, the difficulties of it. And you've just done another piece in which you look back over that 20 years, and I think you've given a number of talks, and you said you've written a number of pieces about that. Could we just kind of unpack that and go over a little bit about your reflections 20 years into that?
Yes, I mean, it's worth going back almost to the beginning. I mean, American politics at the end of the 90s, there was a very strong sort of right-wing group, the so-called neoconservatives,
Yes.
and their Project for the New American
You don't
Century.
hear of them that much anymore,
You
do you?
don't anymore, no, absolutely. But the point about them is that they saw the 1990s as the golden opportunity for the United States to show true leadership. You know, we had this extraordinary position, unipolar world, and we could show the world the way to, I suppose you would call it, a neoliberal future.
Yes.
With sort of a democratic but neoliberal future. And of course, that was one of the aims in the Iraq War eventually, was to actually see that country transition to a full free market. But the point is that when Bush came in end of 2000, many of those people with that group, thought, came in with him. And so the whole security and foreign policy of the United States veered in that direction, a more unilateral direction.
Yes.
We know what we're doing. It's best for the world. We'll carry on. And that's when they withdrew from Kyoto, for example, the climate change accords. Now, you look at that, and by the sort of the middle of 2001, I remember Charles Krauthammer, one of the main writers, memorably used the phrase, we're not just any hegemon. We run a unique imperium. What we're doing is good for the world.
Yeah.
3 months after he wrote that came 9/11.
Yes.
And it was a heck of a shock. Now, obviously, the United States reacted very quickly, a very intense air war, special forces rearming the Northern Alliance, and essentially it seems that the Taliban had gone, defeated, and Al-Qaeda dispersed. In fact, the Taliban just went to ground,
Yes.
and Al-Qaeda dispersed most of its people very effectively. But it looked like things were going very well. Bush gave the reason I'm going into this detail, Bush then gave his State of the Union address in January 2002, and that is when he introduced the concept of the evil empire.
Yes.
The axis of evil.
Yeah.
Sorry, not the evil empire, the axis of evil. And there's where Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, and the second division ones, if I remember, were Syria, Libya, and of course, for some reason, Cuba.
Yes.
But that's part of the American psyche at the time.
100%. Yeah.
And essentially, he said, this war has not ended. We've won this bit, but it hasn't ended. And that's when there was all the concern in Britain about the idea of a war in Iraq. The United States had pretty broad support for what it did in Afghanistan. Personally, I think it was a grave mistake. They should have taken the legal route. And of course, that proved to be the case. But it seemed at the time that they had support. They lost it in droves. Berlusconi in Italy, Blair notably in Britain, stayed with them very strongly. But Germany, France, much more cautious, and public opinion moved quite heavily against in many countries. So the question had to be, well, why Iraq, and why Iraq first? I went to a conference in Washington about 6 weeks after the Axis of Evil speech. And it was a conference about the UN and security, and they had several people from the new Bush administration there. And I got to know a couple of people who'd been in the transition team, just finished the whole process of bringing in the new administration. And I remember there's a group of us, about sort of 7 or 8 of us, having lunch together. The others were mostly Europeans, either mostly activists, think tank people or universities. And one of them asked, I don't think it was me, somebody else asked, why are you going for Iraq? What's this about? He said, the answer was, well, it's not really about Iraq. This is about Iran. And the thinking very clearly was, get Iran right, no problem. Sorry, get Iraq right, no problem. Because then you'll have Iraq sort of to the west of Iran with American bases and the rest. Same in Afghanistan to the east.
Yeah.
Fifth Fleet guarding the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea. Iran, the much bigger country.
Bracketed by those occupied countries.
Yes. And that was very clear. And that's not really come through. People talk about oil. They talk about how bad a dictator Saddam Hussein was. Yes, it's true. But I think that's what's much more important. And of course, so in a sense, I wasn't saying that at the time, but certainly that article that I did for Open Democracy, it was about 3 weeks into the Iraq War, just as victory seemed certain. You know, the American troops were already approaching Baghdad. And all I said was that in the long term, this is going to store up much, much more antagonism, and you're going to get long-term violence. Looking back on that, I'm afraid it was uncomfortably accurate.
Yeah,
because that's what we've seen in so many places. But on reflection, I mean, it's interesting to read, newspapers across the political spectrum now. You expect it from the Guardian Observer,
yes.
but a number of the papers are focusing on what a disaster it was.
Yes,
and I mean, people
even papers
don't know
which supported it.
Yes,
were very supportive
people
of
who
it at the time,
supported
yeah.
it. So, I mean, that is recognised to some extent. And my own view, for what it's worth, is that, in fact, it probably prevented one war. Because if you remember, in 2006, there was a very high state of tension between the Bush administration and Iran.
Yes.
And there was a very real risk of that spinning over. I remember Oxford Research Group actually wrote a booklet called Iran, Consequences of a War. There'd been one about 3 months before the Iraq War, which was pretty accurate. And so they did one for Iran because it was that bad. I think that the huge public outpouring against the Iraq War, including that huge demonstration in London, probably helped make the Blair government much more cautious about supporting Bush in Iran.
Yes.
So without realizing, I think all the peace activists, millions of them, actually did more than they realized at the time. You can't be sure.
No.
But
it's difficult to measure, isn't it?
It's very difficult to measure.
Even 20 years on, it's difficult to measure.
So that's basic sort of gut analysis,
Yes.
if you like. But I think it's still significant.
100%.
But overall, I think we've just not learnt.
Yeah.
And you see it now. I mean, in a sense, Iraq and northern Syria, northern Iraq and northern Syria are still in a very considerable state of violence.
Yes.
Iraq basically has far more Iranian influence than ever did before.
Yeah.
The Iranians have come out of it much better than they went into
strong.
the
Yeah,
start.
strong. This is what
Stronger,
people
much
say.
stronger.
Analysts who seem to know what they're talking about say Iran has been empowered in a sense.
Hugely. And I mean, they have a large control over the political system in Iraq. I mean, Shia do make up the majority of Iraq.
Yeah.
The curious thing is that within the Shia world, while, Iran is the center of what's going on, Iraq theologically is the more important country.
Yes.
And this is one of the reasons why many Shia in Iraq are cautious about getting too close to Tehran, even if during the very difficult years of the Saddam Hussein era, many of them were refugees in Iran for long periods.
Sure, for sure.
So I think the end result is, the other thing I think is worth saying is that, of course, ISIS itself has not gone away.
No.
Right across the Sahel from Mauritania in the west right through to Niger and Chad.
Yes.
Nigeria, Chad towards the east, and then separately in Somalia and in Mozambique and the DRC.
Yes.
You have ISIS-type units linked to that or to Al-Qaeda that are active and not going away.
Yeah, I can remember in just before COVID, I think probably the last time I saw you, it was a declassified meeting. I mentioned I was going to make a documentary in Afghanistan about the zero units, and we got to Jalalabad, went out into the we had some police escorts kind of forced upon us, as you often do, and to discover that there was a small breakaway from the Taliban, but faction of ISIS, in a long way away from Syria and the Levant, and where the birthplace of ISIS was. But these ideological bedfellows, who I think were a split from the Taliban, who'd taken up this more extreme position, and then I mean, clearly they have a foothold. They were trying to bomb the airfield as they were pulling out of Afghanistan. A number of people were killed, and then there was that terrible drone strike and stuff like that. But it would be interesting maybe to move forward and something which is very apparent, or move more closer to today. It's very apparent at the moment. I'm looking at seeing going on Twitter, lots of people, centrists and people on the right, the luminaries like Tim Stanley talking about Iraq and Ukraine as a comparison, and it's a comparison that's being made, and it's probably an uncomfortable one for a lot of people who supported the war. And the basic argument seems to be what we did to Iraq is similar. And we should take note of the fact that Ukraine is similar. I'm cautious about it. I'm very cautious about doing that because clearly there are parallels, but there are also fundamental differences. And I'm also conscious that over Ukraine, what's emerged is a strange kind of quite retro, almost campist thing. I think people are looking for a Russia that maybe they would have supported in the past and no longer exists. And it's very, very complicated. I'm kind of struggling to unpick it. So it would be really useful for me, but also I suspect for our listeners to maybe examine, for you to reflect on what are the parallels and what are the differences here.
Yeah, I think I mean I'm not sure myself. It's not easy to work out in terms of the long term. Where do you start?
I suppose there's a war of aggression. Is there a war of? I get that.
It's a war of aggression,
and it's an invasion which is unjustified. If an invasion ever could be justified, I suppose that seems to be the starting point. But after that, it gets kind of foggy to me.
Yes, it does.
It's very complicated.
Yeah, I mean, what started obviously was that Putin's people expected a war lasting maybe 2 to 3 weeks.
Yes.
You know,
Sounds familiar.
if they could succeed in taking that airfield, the Antonov airfield just outside Kyiv, and then bring troops in very quickly, decapitate the government, as they would call it, terminate the regime, and then all would be, if not well, it would be more mopping up rather than that.
Yes.
And that went wrong from the start because one suspects the Ukrainians were getting 24/7 intelligence of the United States, second by second.
Yeah.
They were being told exactly what was going on, and that started right from the start. And so it went badly wrong for Russia, and so it's deteriorated into a terrible war of attrition. And obviously, but on the other hand, in some way, people who make the other connection are right in that if you look at what happened to the old city of Mosul, when ISIS was being sort of destroyed, and you look at the photos that came out of that, they're so like Mariupol.
Yes.
And the same on a smaller scale with Ramadi, and certainly with Racket. And you look at earlier on the siege of Fallujah.
Yes.
In what was it, 2004?
Yes.
I mean, the city was devastated. So I suppose the difference here initially was that the war in Ukraine was showing people in the West exactly what modern warfare is like.
Yes.
I remember talking to an Arab friend of mine about how Al Jazeera was covering the war, and it was rather tougher on what was really happening. This is the Iraq War. And he said, well, you want to watch Al Jazeera Arabic, because then they show what's really going on.
Yes.
Because, of course, there was so much self-censorship as far as the West was concerned.
Sure.
And so I think what we saw originally was a view of the war which was very much anti-Russian, aided by what the Russians are doing.
Yes.
Not realizing that this is what happens in wars.
Yes.
I mean, there are some explanations. Trouble is, if you start explaining what Putin's motives were concerned, then you become called an appeaser.
Yes.
But the reality is that Putin has played very skillfully on the idea that Russians over the age of 40 or so have deeply embedded that Russia was treated with contempt when the Soviet Union came
I've heard you speak about this. It's very interesting. I've heard you speak about this before, that there is a lingering...
There is.
Because of the way Russia was treated after the Soviet Union collapsed.
Yeah. Yes, and I think he played on that from 2000 onward very cleverly. And his whole business about making Russia great again. He got it terribly wrong on the military side. They thought they'd have a modernized military, but it wasn't sort of trained for the kind of warfare that they were going for.
No.
Or the kind of warfare they hadn't expected, put it that way. So essentially you have a very, very bitter war. It's more of a conventional war. It is very clearly a major proxy war. Because now you have NATO hugely involved.
Yes.
And the whole pace of the war, in fact, is dictated very much from Washington.
Yes.
What weapons are provided and when. You saw the HIMARS weapons coming in, those very accurate multiple rocket launchers. And it turns out virtually every time the Ukrainians fire them, they check on the latest American intelligence first.
Yes.
And I'm talking about sort of by the minute or by the second even. So essentially, in a sense, Putin has a much easier job of saying NATO is attacking us.
Yes.
And so what he's done, I think, more recently over the last 2 or 3 months is basically convince a large part of the Russian population, particularly I think people over 30, maybe over 40, that Russia is under attack, which in a sense it is, having started the war. But because of that, he has more support than most people, including, I think, most analysts, appreciate it in the West. And he is still succeeding with that, partly because Russia is tolerably successful economically because of what it's producing, the oil and gas and the rest. But at the same time, that can't last. But in the short term, I don't, as far as we can tell, you listen to the really good Kremlinologists, so to speak, they say he isn't frankly under threat unless a very unexpected coup attempt happens.
Yes.
And so that probably means the war is on for a long time yet, I'm afraid.
Yeah. It's I think something that's emerged in the last few days, which can kind of open up another topic for us, is there was a very grand, and I don't know how performative it is, declaration, arrest warrant for Putin, and one of his associates, whose name I forget, by the International Criminal Court. And at the same, there's also what has emerged with that is a kind of pushback, which again hinges around a comparison to Iraq, which is wow, why isn't Blair in The Hague, and why is Alistair Campbell free to do his 20-year memorial podcast on Iraq? And so on and so on. I think it would be interesting just to kind of look at the ICC a little bit and look at its limitations. I think there's a general perception that it only tries African dictators and Balkan warlords. I mean, what is the break on bringing to justice potential war criminals who are a bit closer to home? I mean, what is really the dynamic there? Is it just that it's a Western institution that can only look outwards, can only look at the margins and not reflect? I mean, what is the dynamic with the ICC?
That is what is happening in effect.
Yes.
The real issue is whether going for one of the major states, one of the members of the Security Council, begins to make people change their minds about whether it should be going for other states.
Yes, okay.
So I think it's what you say is fascinating. It's opening up an area which I hadn't expected, I must admit. But people are asking, well, if Putin, why not so-and-so?
Yes.
Now, that obviously is people who either were or have become very antagonistic to the wars that the West has been fighting. But on the other hand, there's a lot in it which I think does widen the debate a great deal. Where that will go, I don't know.
Yes.
Because at the moment, you also have to reconcile that within Western security thinking, there's a large sort of emphasis on the idea that let this war go on, because the longer it goes on, the weaker Russia becomes. And our big problem for the future, obviously, is a Sino-Russian alliance,
Yes.
the new real power in the world. And if one part of that alliance is weakened by an interminable war, well, that's well and good.
Yes.
There was that awful comment, a very thoughtful one, NATO will fight to the last Ukrainian.
Yes, yeah.
And of course, there virtually, apart from special forces, there's virtually no Westerners and volunteers actually in Ukraine at the present time.
And that is the question, isn't it, which I keep coming back to. My sense is that there are various interests, various actors for whom extending the war is useful, not least arms firms as well, who seem to be turning a good buck out of it. But at what cost and to whom? And it seems to be, I mean, is there also a question there? It's certainly a question of interest to me. When I look at the places I've been, Afghanistan, Kenya, where there's problems with UXO, which our friend Phil Miller reports on very well, a country flooded with weapons, even if the war ends, what are the implications for Ukraine in the long term? That's a concern to me in the long view, because there are massive amounts of military, high-tech, advanced military hardware, which tend to migrate, in my knowledge, tend to wander off and get lost.
We saw that notoriously in Libya, of course.
Yes,
in that after the collapse of the regime, essentially there was a massive vacuum. And it also became a vehicle, a route, in fact, for all kinds of light arms down towards the south of the Sahel, right across the Sahel and elsewhere, and indeed some radical paramilitary groups as well.
Yes.
Yeah, that obviously is very difficult to predict. What you have to say is that worldwide, this is a classic case of now thrive the armourers.
Yes.
I mean, the armourers haven't had it so good since the height of the Cold War.
No.
And I don't just mean the Western ones. I mean, true in China, true in Russia, certainly true in India. Yeah. I mean, any country with a sizable armed forces and its own defence industry, this is a good time to be around. which is a brutal way of putting it, but it's a realistic thing. And we're basically moving away from the idea of trying to rethink security, moving away from the whole idea of recognizing the huge problems of wars. I mean, I like that Quaker comment, what is it? If war is the answer, it's a stupid question.
Yes.
Very simple, very straightforward.
Yeah.
And so often it's absolutely right.
Yes.
But where that takes us from here, I mean, you just have to keep going, obviously, on it.
Yes.
But what you're saying, that this making people think a bit about, one law for the warlords and the dictators of the South, another law for us. Well, in a sense, Russia is, quotes, more like us.
Yes, okay,
and that is the thing. I mean, I was listening to one of the prosecutors on the International Criminal Court saying that, in fact, they would be open to other things. They did look at Iraq, but they didn't get anything out. It's certainly true that I think the area they've gone for Putin is probably the area which is a discrete area for which there is direct evidence.
Yes.
And they've chosen that very carefully. It's probably more difficult to do it in the case of other wars. But it may be a first sign of a change in attitude to the legality of war.
Yes. So I think I kind of touched on it earlier, that there's a number of things. We've had a wide range of guests on this season, on think tanks, on the civil service, on defence spending, on the arms trade, all of whom were fascinating in their own right. But there were particular themes which have jumped out across all of those interviews very consistently. And one of those is that to look more internally at Britain, there is a profound interconnection in this country of big business, not just arms firms, but arms firms, of the media, of the military, and also of democratic institutions. I'm talking about the kind of the term generally used is revolving door, but when we've looked at this as Forces Watch, it's almost inadequate. It's almost not. It's almost that they seem to have become part of one mass, which is interchangeable. Such is the level of interconnection between these things. I wonder if that term really covers it. Is that a character? Is that just me, or is that a characterization that you recognise?
It's very much a characterization I recognise. And in fact, I think, as I get on in years, that comes home to me more and more, the way in which the system is really closely integrated. I mean, Mary Calder wrote a book, was it The Baroque Arsenals, many years ago, which was touching on this in many ways, well ahead of its time. And I think also, if you look at the whole business of what we call the military-industrial complex, it is very pervasive and invasive. It sort of goes into all kinds of ways. I think it's geared in Britain's case, and probably in the French case at all, that we're the two countries which notably have delusions of post-imperial grandeur. And for us, defence is really what we got. And you see this very much because you got the connection through to the right wing, the far right, and in some ways even extreme right on occasions. Of a system which is confident when it's dealing with things military, because, quotes, we were a great military power.
Yes.
It doesn't really come up to the reality that we are not that.
No. This is very apparent in the military, I have to say.
Absolutely.
Punching above our weight.
Yes.
And all this stuff.
But what I find tragic is that Britain is actually in a country which, if it had a very different security policy, could be very important. It's the one way in which a country of our sort of size, partly because of conditions of history, could be a notable country, put it this way. I remember writing a piece tongue-in-cheek about trying to rethinking the term great when it applies to Britain.
Yes.
Because obviously even that can be looking a little bit too sort of martial in a way.
Yes.
But I think the point is that we are so stuck in our history, and it is so important. And basically, there's strings which should be very easily plucked.
Yes.
This is one of the reasons why the Labour Party is in such a dire state at present when it comes to defence.
Yes.
It just can't think new things. I mean, there are one or two very good Labour MPs around. I won't name them for fear of damning them forever. But the point is, there are some ones who are trying to think it through.
Yes.
But the reality is that the Labour Party is not in any way presenting any kind of sense on defence. It's basically frightened too.
Yes.
Simply because of the risk of being called unpatriotic. But that's part of a wider issue, is that there's a whole culture You get it in some Latin American countries coming from different aspects of their culture. You certainly get it in France, and you get it in Britain. You get it for very different reasons in the United States, having been and claiming to be still basically the big superpower.
Yes.
And you certainly get it in Russia as well, which I think privately many Russians are having problems coming to terms with the way in which they are bogged down in Ukraine.
Yes.
But Britain is rare in this mind. I remember David G., I think, described it also as a culture of, hegemonic masculinity.
Yes.
It's very much, as you said, it's very much linked to the business area. It's very profitable. It really is. I mean, the work that Andrew Feinstein and the others have done on the arms trade, the recent stuff, is really very good.
Very good. Yeah.
Interestingly, Anthony Sampson, who wrote a similar book, I think 35 years ago, and wasn't considered in any way sort of lefty, they regard that as a pretty good book, The Arms Bazaar. Because, of course, that came out at about the time as the so-called Lockheed trials, when there were first sort of civil actions which brought into the open the degree of corruption in arms sales. Yeah. It didn't particularly apply to Lockheed. There were others involved as well. But the point is that it is part of a wider system which is absolutely set in its ways, very profitable, and it goes through into the military as well. And the number of times, I've got to know people who are pretty senior in defence colleges, and when they retire, immediately they become consultants.
Yes.
I can think of 2 cabinet-level Labour MPs, one a cabinet minister, one a number in the States, both of whom went on to work for arms companies when they retired. And you could name more. Okay, it's true in other areas. People who are on the health side, they end up working for private health companies. But with defence, it's different. And I think it goes back time and time again to we don't understand what we mean by security. It's so dealt with in military terms. I mean, I find I do it myself a lot when I'm speaking. I don't say we should be talking about human security, because for most people that's far more important. But again, it's an area where we've got a long way to go, and the forces of current developments are rather against us. But what you were saying just a few minutes ago about the way in which the war crimes thing is being looked at by many people, it makes you think that people are alert to the, not the inadequacies, I don't know what term to use, the problems with seeing things in the old way.
Yes.
It doesn't mean that in any way Russia is good or right. But what it does mean, it means maybe we should be questioning a little bit about what we do.
Yes, yes. I think that's certainly over the course of Ukraine. And I know my friends were messaging me the day before the invasion, being like, "Oh, Joe knows about these things. He was in the army. Will they invade?" And I was like, "No, of course not." And then the next day it happened. So I'm certainly certainly no expert in that department. But I suppose I look at what's happened over that period, and I have a weird distinction in that I spent a couple of years working for RT UK as a journalist, so I kind of understand a little bit that side. Yeah. And I also deployed to Afghanistan with NATO. I kind of know NATO, and I know a bit about the Russian state, and I have no love for either of them. So I find myself, when people are kind of backing one uncritically or without thinking, it's very uncomfortable. It's very uncomfortable to see that. I think there's a sense with I was in Afghanistan with ISAF, which is kind of derivative. It comes under NATO. I forget the complexities of it, and I almost there's a strange thing where it's in my mind. The only way I can describe it is kind of become FBPE with guns. Yes. There's a particular set of politics, a particular schema of people in politics who've kind of transitioned to NATO as their thing. Yeah. And I don't think that's coming from a reasoned posision. If you know what I mean? I think and I can understand it's very emotive. Obviously, Ukraine deserves its territorial integrity. Russia shouldn't be there. It's all very obvious to me, but it's just I feel so many of the nuances and the complexities and that rush to take a position misses so much stuff. I wanted to come back to another theme theme which is very apparent, which you touched on a little bit there, and it's the idea that you're talking about empire and the hangover from empire, which Russia also has. Absolutely. And you've spoken about that very articulately. On Novara, I think last year, I remember an interview with you talking about the hangover of that. But across our guests, this idea of a lingering coloniality across various, most of the guests have been experts on a particular area, but in the civil service, in the police, in the military, in democratic institutions, there is this lingering coloniality, which, for want of a better expression, gets in the way, slows us down, hinders us, prevents progress to some degree. Do you recognise that as something that's true? And what do you think its implications are for Britain?
I think it's absolutely true. And I mean, I think it's this problem, the phrase you use, delusions of post-imperial grandeur. We still think we're much more significant and more powerful than we actually are. You know, I mean, one of our sons and his family live in Switzerland. And, you know, we were over there very soon, Claire and I were both over there for a short trip, just a few days after Brexit. And, you know, friends of theirs in Switzerland could not understand why the British were doing this.
Yes.
It seemed so incredibly short-sighted to be turning away from Europe. And that, I think, is part of the whole system. It became, you could popularize it in a particular way. A combination of sort of politicians, Farage and Johnson, were clever at doing that. And obviously it does serve a purpose. And that, I think, is one thing. In other words, it is easy to get popularity by playing on this particular tune, because it is deeply embedded within Britain. As I say, it's true of other countries in different ways, the United States and particularly France. But you look at how many countries you have the leaders trying to make us great again. I mean, there's Erdogan, there's Modi, there's Macron, obviously there's Putin. There's various people on the right and Conservative Party, and then there are the Republicans in the United States, all trying to sort of, in most cases, trying to regain something or find something.
Yes,
but in a very traditional view of security.
Yes, and it's like kind of nostalgia. It's like a nostalgist politics, but it seems different from normal conservatism somehow.
It is
more radical.
Yeah.
But it's, as you say, it's struck through with hyper masculinity and grievance and militarism. It's always militarized, isn't it?
Yeah, it is very much so. And I think that's going to be, I mean, you could imagine a different kind of Britain, which had actually got over its imperial hang-ups or neo-imperial hang-ups and was actually sort of moved on. And it would be a Britain which really was making huge progress on the whole renewable side, and we're incredibly well endowed with that. I mean, we're lucky. Two of our sons are engineers, and one is a maritime engineer. A lot of his work is about offshore wind farms, and another is actually a lecturer in renewable energy engineering. He's an assistant prof at Nottingham Trent, just moved to Nottingham Trent. So he worked for 7 years in Barbados at the university there. So he knows all about sort of worldwide decarbonisation. And so much can be done so quickly. Britain could be the exemplar of that, and we're not. We missed a trick on that. We could be far more prominent in sort of more genuine peacekeeping. The very few occasions where Britain has played a fairly substantive role in peacekeeping, in Croatia in particular, the British have actually shown themselves to be quite good at it.
Yes.
And certainly it's also true for a time, until things went terribly wrong in the Horn of Africa, of Canada as well. I remember a friend who was a Canadian academic had actually done a bit of a study of the attitude of the ordinary Canadian troops in, I think it was Croatia. And they actually ended up sort of embracing a very different kind of function. And a country like Britain, which has fairly small but certainly very capable armed forces, could do that in looking at a very different way. Instead of which, we're wasting billions on Trident and on 2 dirty grade aircraft carriers. I mean, we're trying to...
Which sometimes work, sometimes...
Yeah. We're trying to play a global role when there's a different kind of global role.
Yes.
And I would have loved to see the Labour Party take this. I mean, this may show me for my politics, but the most interesting speech on security I've read in the last 10 years is the one that Jeremy Corbyn gave when he was getting a Peace Prize in Geneva. I think it was in 2017. And basically, he set out a very different way where the British foreign policy, far more rooted in human rights, far more rooted in anti-poverty, in basically peacekeeping, and in environmental stuff. And that's a very rare example, come from somebody who, for a brief period, was actually significant. And people of that ilk may well be again.
Yes, it was almost surprising that suddenly things I had thought since I was learning at uni, peace-related stuff, were suddenly being spoken about in the mainstream. It was very odd.
Yeah.
because I almost felt a sense of ownership that
Yes.
that it had been kind of taken and spread in that way. It's interesting. I remember at an epiphanal moment for me, I think, came during that time. It was actually an SMP. I think he was a counsellor, and he was an Irish guy. He was from the Republic of Ireland, but he was had been a Royal Navy submarine commander, and he was addressing questions about Trident and stuff, because the answer is always jobs.
Yes.
But there's jobs, and he said, no, look, this country is full of brilliant engineers who work on this stuff, and you could take them and tell them to build something else, and they would do a great job of that.
Yeah.
As well. And I suppose it'd be good maybe to round up, just to stick with that theme a little bit, because the opportunity which we've just discussed, the kind of Corbyn opportunity, has gone, and I think we have to accept that. It feels like the longest political seance in history that we rake over the coals. I think we can take things from that and go, but where else can we find inspiration? Where will these ideas come from? Where can this where do we look now? Where do we look now for the inspiration and the ideas for this Britain which is trying to be born, which could be better? Where do we look?
I think all over. I think there is a lot going on. I mean, mentioning earlier on the Rethinking Security Group, which is trying to think these things through and getting very interesting people together on occasions. But I think there are a whole range of areas where we can see the beginnings of a change. Much of it is going to be focused initially on the immediacy of climate breakdown.
Yes.
I think probably we were more or less told, about 2 or 3 years ago, that we needed to decarbonise by 7% per year for the next 10 years. It now has to be about 10% per year for the remaining 7 years, because we haven't done it. But the problem is that we're seeing time and time again the actual impact of climate breakdown. That's very different from even 10 years ago. And essentially, there has to be the wake-up call, and it has to come soon, and it has to be extremely radical. You probably can't do it effectively without a lot of state planning and state intervention, which basically goes directly against the whole market fundamentalism neoliberal view of how economics should work.
Yeah.
So it throws into question the second of the major problems. So it's not just that it gives us an opportunity to see what has to be done in an absolutely crucial short-term area. It relates really to one of the longer-term problems of a failing world economy, but also to the fact that in all of this, I have to say that things like Ukraine are minor compared with a worldwide problem which faces everybody. So I think it's an area where if people can start talking about how much has to happen, the point is there's no alternative to this. Otherwise there's that marvelous paper. It was written by a guy called Edwin Brooks, and it was given at a conference 50 years ago at a meeting on ecology and development down at the old Huddersfield Polytechnic. And Tony Vann and I were two of the academics who helped organise it. This guy, Edwin Brooks, is an economic geographer from Liverpool. He'd also been an MP and was chair of, I think, the Conservation Society at the time. He went and had a good academic career in Australia. Last I heard, he was in his 90s and still active. But Edwin, I remember, wrote a paper, and he had this phrase. He talked about the possibility of sort of a much better world, and the possibility of just sailing on now. He said, of course, it could go all wrong. What we would end up with was a crowded, glowering planet of massive inequalities of wealth, buttressed by stark force, yet endlessly threatened by desperate people in the global ghettos. And that one phrase, which I've used to death, I use it a lot, it summarizes the dystopia that we do actually face. Only 50 years later, it's remarkable to say that then, 50 years later, we're far closer to it. And people are actually becoming aware of it. And this is why now is the opportunity where the new kinds of thinking, applying the new technologies and looking at the way the economy runs is all going to be thrown into the melting pot. I mean, I'm 80 now. I'd love to live to 90 because that would take me through the 2020s and maybe into the 2030s. Probably won't make it, but at least, so far so good. But the point is, I think it's going to be an immensely significant period. It's the period where things really could go much better when we're not expecting it. It's also a period where, there's so many dangers. I mean, when we're recording this, I gather today the climate change people are bringing out their latest study. I don't know what it'll show, but my guess is it's going to say there are ways forward, but by golly, it's going to be tight. And I think that in a sense, it means that we are being forced to face up to changes which are absolutely necessary, which many people would thoroughly endorse, and for a country like Britain could be very significant. It might even be a saving grace instead of sort of a country which is disappearing into a sort of down the plug hole, so to speak. Because that, I think, is more where it may be heading at present. I mean, this is the worry that, our youngest grandchild is 5 weeks old. And he
Congratulations.
Yes. And, but he will, inshallah, God willing, he will be alive in the 22nd century. In fact, all our grandchildren could be like that. And so what I like to think about is when they're sort of, don't need to be as old as me, but certainly when they're in the 60s and 70s, in the latter part of this century, will they look back and think, well, that's when we started to get it right and make the good changes? And that, I think, is why it is so important for people like us to be pushing hard.
Yes.
Because it's actually a time of great worry, but also a time of huge opportunity.
Paul Rogers, a note of optimism, a note of hope at the end. That's exactly what we need. I could do another hour and probably another hour after that, but we must tie it up. Thank you so much for coming on. You've been a great guest.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.
No problem.
And good luck with your work.